I never planned to be remembered. Most men who return from war just want to forget or learn to live with what never goes away. And I managed for a long time. Years passed, and everything I lived through stayed buried deep, locked not only in the drawers of the house, but also in the quietest corners of my mind. The uniform remained folded, untouched, as if still waiting for a new call to duty. The medals, hidden in an old box, because each one reminded me more of what I lost than what I gained. Here in the neighborhood, they knew me only as Mr. Lee, the quiet widower from the corner house, the one who tended to his rose bushes with the same discipline a sergeant applied to a march. I lived alone, but I didn't complain. My world was small, controlled, bitter coffee at the same time every day, the newspaper folded on the porch, the wall clock marking the slow rhythm of my days. Until one ordinary morning, I needed to reorganize. The garage, that part of the house no one enters, where time stacks its memories. I went looking for a wrench and ended up stumbling over a cardboard box with my name on it, written in handwriting I barely recognized as my own. When I opened it, the smell hit me first. Aged paper, leather, decades of dust, and then the images. A letter stained with fingerprints, a black and white photo of faces I haven't seen since 1969. A worn metal decoration, its ribbon still folded in silence. My heart didn't race. It sank. There, amid the garage's clutter, the past stared back at me, and in that moment I knew this couldn't stay hidden. Not anymore. I started pulling objects from the box, like someone unearthing bones from a grave no one visits anymore. My hands knew what they were doing, even if my heart resisted. This wasn't just dust or memory. It was part of me, of a version, of myself frozen in time, on the other side of the world, clutching a rifle and swallowing fear between curt orders. The canteen, still smelling of rust and wet earth, brought back nights when thirst was the least of my problems. The dog tags, still grimy with time and sweat, clinked softly when I held them, as if calling me again by a number that once replaced my name. Among the stacks of paper, I found a letter I never sent. It was addressed to my wife, scribbled in haste with a carpenter's pencil during the only moment of silence I'd had in weeks. It spoke of longing, of fear, of a simple request. If I come back, forgive me for what I'll bring with me. And I did come back. But I never showed that letter to anyone, until that day when I read it again, alone, with blurred eyes, and words trembling in my throat. There was no intention to start anything, but in that moment I felt something different. It wasn't nostalgia or sadness, it was weight, a weight I'd carried for years, always silenced because I thought the world had already forgotten. Somehow that weight demanded a place. It demanded to be let out of the box. So I left the objects there, on an old table that had always sat unused. I ran my fingers over the edges of the photo of my platoon. I hung the battalion insignia on a solitary nail in the wall. I didn't think about beauty. I didn't think about meaning. I just let them be. The next day, I came back. Not out of necessity, but for something deeper, more restless. I rearranged the items, cleaned the dusty glass of an old frame, lined up the medals in the order they were received, not out of vanity, but out of respect. It was as if, with each gesture, I was cleaning not just the objects, but a part of my history I'd hidden from myself for too long. That's when I realized I was returning there every day, no longer by chance, but by need. The garage, once forgotten, became my daily destination. It was no longer just a place for old tools or dusty boxes. Little by little, it became the only space where I felt whole. I started caring for those objects like someone tending to sacred graves. I oiled the cracked leather of the old campaign. A backpack, polished the boots that had carried me through trails of fear and mud with a clean cloth. I found a small acrylic display case, once used for my kids' toy cars, and placed the decorations in it, each one labeled in my shaky but steady handwriting. It was on a cold Sunday morning that everything changed. The garage door was open as usual, and I was inside, sitting on the wooden bench, reorganizing a set of letters. A boy, maybe 10 years old, rode by slowly on his bike, stopped and looked. I thought he'd move on, but he got off, hung his helmet on the handlebars, and asked, "Sir, is all this real?" I nodded, didn't say anything else. He stood there, staring in silence, eyes wide at the helmet, the photo of the soldiers, the small flag folded carefully on the table. After a while he said, "Wow," and left. But the next day he came back. He brought another kid with him. And in that moment, without warning, without preparation, without intending to, I realized something was happening. I wasn't just pulling objects out of the darkness. I was pulling my own story out of silence, and without planning it, I had opened the door for the world, even if it started with just 1 or 2 kids, to hear what I'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. That morning, I opened the garage door with a strange feeling in my chest, a mix of anticipation and apprehension. I, who had always valued solitude as a safe trench, began to realize I was waiting for footsteps, for voices, for someone who cared about what I had to show, and it didn't take long. The boy with the bike came back, with another kid by his side, both with wide eyes and fidgety feet. I stood there, watching from the shadows, not saying a word. When I saw them pointing at the helmet and whispering to each other, I approached, with the calm of someone who didn't want to startle, but with the firmness of someone carrying too much weight in their chest to pretend. Lightness. "This saved my head more than once," I said, touching the scratched and dented metal. They laughed, but not out of mockery. It was awe, the kind of respect you only learn by looking into the eyes of someone who's lived through it. The next day, 2 more came. By the end of the week, the garage was too small for the comings and goings of kids, teenagers, and even a few curious parents who vaguely recalled a grandfather who'd fought in some war. I found myself surrounded by questions, simple questions that took my breath away. Was it loud? Were you scared? Did all your friends come back with you? Each time I answered, I felt the words come from a place I didn't even remember existed. They weren't rehearsed answers or clever phrases. They were raw truths, sometimes painful, but always spoken with the dignity of someone who knows you can't erase a scar, but you can teach it to tell its story. Over time, what began as an intimate gesture turned into a quiet movement in the neighborhood. I no longer had control over who came or when. The garage door stayed half open almost all day, and visitors arrived as if drawn by something stronger than curiosity, as if that small space held a force none of us could name. Kids who used to walk by with their heads down started looking up when they saw me. Children who once ran past on the sidewalk now slowed down, pointed, and begged their parents. "I want to see the old man's war museum." Some adults came with their kids, others came alone, bringing old photos, pieces of uniforms passed down through generations, letters forgotten in wooden boxes at the back of the house. One man brought his father's medal, which he never fully understood. A woman cried when she saw her uncle's name in the background of a black and white photo I'd taped to the wall. The stories began to intertwine. Mine with theirs, theirs with those who came before, all tied by an invisible thread of longing, respect, and belonging. And I, who for decades feared my story would be forgotten, now found myself the guardian of many. I started organizing the visits. I created a guest book where kids could leave questions and comments. A 12-year-old boy wrote, "You're the bravest person I've ever met." A teenage girl drew my portrait in colored pencil and left it on the makeshift bulletin board I'd made with cardboard and clothespins. Sometimes I'd find myself there, alone at night, rereading each note with the same care a soldier gives to a last letter from home. And in that process, so slow, so sacred, I realized it was no longer about me. That garage was no longer mine. It belonged to memory. And memory, when tended with truth, doesn't age. It blooms. I never imagined such a small space could hold so much meaning. The garage, once a storage for stifled memories, now overflowed with life. The makeshift walls, which once held boxes and tools, now bore faces, dates, handwritten stories. People started calling me curator, the museum man, but I never saw myself that way. To me, it was still a humble attempt to keep alive the names of those the years nearly erased. And then the local school knocked on my door. It was a young teacher with bright eyes and a soft voice. She said her students kept talking about the War Museum and asked, with all respect, if I'd allow a class to visit. My first instinct was to pull back, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what was there. I didn't want to turn something sacred to me into a spectacle, but I agreed, and I prepared the space like an old soldier polishing his uniform one last time, with precision, reverence, and silence. That afternoon, when I saw the group of 20 kids filing in, eyes alert, notebooks clutched to their chests, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Nervousness. Not the kind of tension before a battle, but something more human. The desire to be worthy of the attention of those young lives. I started slowly. I showed the canteen, the insignia, the folded letter I never sent. I spoke about my comrades without rehearsing speeches, just letting memory speak for me. The kids listened as if hearing a story no one had ever told. One boy raised his hand and asked if I still remembered all their names. Every single one, I said, and I began listing them, slowly, name by name, like a silent rosary. The teacher cried. Another boy asked if any of them came back. I said some did, but many didn't. And that, perhaps having them there with me in that small space, was the most honest way to bring them back, even if just for a moment. When the visit ended, one girl lingered. She looked at me, eyes welling up, and hugged me as if she knew me. Quietly she said, "Thank you for remembering them, because now I'll remember them too." In that moment, everything made sense. The pain, the years of silence, the nights. I woke up in a cold sweat without knowing why. What I'd hidden for so long had finally found its place, and I realized what I was building there wasn't just a museum. It was an altar of memory, a sanctuary of truth. And in that altar, for the first time, I began to find peace. It didn't take long for the story to spread beyond the neighborhood. First, it was a small article in the local paper, written by a young man who came with his father, took a few discreet photos, and asked questions with rare kindness. I thought it would go nowhere, but days later my mailbox started filling up. Letters. So many letters. Some from old comrades who somehow were still around. Others from the children and grandchildren of veterans, thanking me for keeping alive a memory that in many families had turned to silence. Some wrote just to say thank you, and strangely that was the gratitude that moved me most. The garage, which once held my memories, now held the memories of others. Objects arrived by mail, badges, photos, diary scraps, and with each item, a subtle request: take care of this for us. It was as if, unintentionally, I'd become the caretaker of what time insisted on erasing. One day I opened the gate and found a woman standing there clutching a folder. She looked me in the eyes, tears held back, and said, "My father died in the war. I never knew how. I found his name on your wall." The folder held photos of him as a young man, letters exchanged with her mother, and a question that had spanned generations. I invited her in. I showed her the field diary where his name appeared next to mine and told her what I remembered. They weren't glorious details. They were simple human memories: how he shared his bread, how he kept his humor even on the worst days, how he spoke of his daughter with shining eyes. She didn't cry, She just sat, holding the diary as if holding her father, and stayed there. In silence. Sometimes silence says everything pain needs to hear. It was then, with painful and serene clarity, that I understood. My story was never just mine. It was part of something bigger, something that needed to be told, not out of vanity, but out of duty. Because when you carry memories others can no longer keep, telling becomes a responsibility. Over the months, that garage stopped being just an extension of my house. It was as if it had become an extension of the town, or perhaps of collective memory itself. It wasn't rare to see cars slowing down in front of the gate, entire families stepping out, some coming from other states. People who'd heard of the old man's garage and wanted to see it for themselves. I, who used to barely speak at the market, now found myself invited to give talks at schools, visit scout groups, and answer handwritten letters in childish scrawl. People who'd never lived through a war, but felt touched by those narrow walls covered in memories. There was, in every visit, a kind of quiet reverence. Not for me, but for what had resisted forgetting. I started noticing a transformation. In myself, too. The stiffness in my shoulders, which I'd always chalked up to age, was actually the weight of years of silence. And now, that weight was beginning to dissolve. My hands, once steady only in duty, now trembled with emotion when holding an old photo brought by someone. Sometimes I'd sit in the old armchair in the corner of the garage and just watch. Watch people move among the objects, whisper to each other, read the notes with care, touch the artifacts gently as if touching something sacred. It was like watching time fold in on itself. The older ones were moved, the younger ones learned, and I, in the middle, was just the bridge, the thread connecting yesterday to now. One day, at the end of a visit, a boy of maybe 8 said to me, "Mr. Lee, when I grow up, I want to tell stories like you." It hit me like an unexpected bullet. Because in that moment, I understood he didn't just want to learn about the war. He wanted to learn listening, remembering, respect. The war itself, no one wants to repeat. But memory, that deserves to be multiplied. And if one child left, they're determined to remember, then it was all worth it. Time, with its quiet wisdom, took its place. The visits became less frequent. The faces of the children changed. Some families moved away, others returned to their routines. But the garage remained, not as a tourist spot or local attraction, but as what it always was, from the beginning. A place where truth rests without needing to shout. I still open the gate almost every day, even when no one shows up. I like sitting there in the corner, listening to the silence, letting memory keep me company. Sometimes someone comes, sometimes they don't, but I'm no longer restless about it, because I know I've done my part. I gave voice to what was silent. I gave a face to what was absence. I gave names to those time nearly erased, and it's curious to think how it all started with a forgotten box, hidden behind tools and dust. Back then, I believed it was too late to tell anything, that the world no longer cared. Today, I know a story doesn't die when men pass on. It dies when no one tells it. And as long as I breathe, this space will stand. Even if one day my hands can no longer hang photos or open envelopes, even if my body fails me, as it inevitably will. Because now, even if I go, the museum remains. And with it, my comrades remain. The letters, the names, the memories remain. And so do the children who left here carrying more than facts in their hearts. They carried respect, humanity, and the certainty that every life told is a flame lit against forgetting. And if one day someone walks in, not knowing me, and asks, "Who was this man who kept all this?" let them answer simply, "He was a soldier who chose not to stay silent." Today, the house still stands on the same quiet street with its simple windows and well-tended rose bushes. But the garage is no longer just a garage. It's a reliquary of memory, a living piece of history that refused to die. The neighbors still call it the Old Soldiers' Museum, even after his wooden chair went empty. And when someone steps inside for the first time, they feel, even without knowing, that they're standing in a place where time was respected. In the corner of the wall, there's a small wooden plaque, hand-carved by one of the visitors. It reads, "Here rest stories that conquered silence, and there they rest indeed, with honor, with truth, with the weight and beauty of someone who had the courage to remember when it was easier to forget. And as long as there are curious eyes, reverent hands and hearts willing to listen, this museum will live on, because memory, when shared with love, becomes a legacy."